Chapter 11. And all was to stay well for a time at least, for the war suddenly moved away from us that spring. We knew it was not over, for we could still hear distant thunder of the guns, and the troops came marching through the farmyard from time to time up towards the line. But there were fewer wounded now to bring in, and we were needed less and less to pull our ambulance cart back and forth from the trenches. Topthorne and I were put out to grass in the meadow by the pond most days, but the evenings were still cold, with the occasional frost, and our Emily would always come to get us in before dark. She did not need to lead us. She had but to call and we followed. Emily was still weak from her illness and coughed a great deal as she fussed around us in the stable. From time to time now she would heave herself up onto my back, and I would walk so gently around the yard and out into the meadow with Topthorne following close behind. She used no reins on me, no saddle, no bits, no spurs, and sat astride me not as my mistress, but rather as a friend. Topthorne was just that much taller and broader than me, and she found it very difficult to mount him, and even more difficult to get down. Sometimes she would use me as a stepping stone to Topthorne, but it was a difficult manoeuvre for her, and more than once she fell off in the attempt. But between Topthorne and me there was never any jealousy, and he was quite content to plod around beside us and take her on board whenever she felt like it. One evening we were out in the meadow sheltering under the chestnut tree from the heat of the new summer sun, when we heard the sound of an approaching convoy of lorries coming back from the front. As they came through the farm gate, they called out to us, and we recognised them as the orderlies, nurses and doctors from the field hospital. As the convoy stopped in the yard, we galloped over to the gate by the pond and looked over. Emily and her grandfather emerged from the milking shed and were in deep conversation with the doctor. Quite suddenly, we found ourselves besieged by all the orderlies we had come to know so well. They climbed the fence and patted and smoothed us with great affection. They were exuberant, yet somehow sad at the same time. Emily was running over towards us, shouting and screaming. "I knew it would happen," she said. "I knew it. I prayed for it to happen, and it did happen. They don't need you any more to pull their carts. They're moving the hospital further up along the valley. There's a big, big battle going on up there, and so they're moving away from us. But they don't want to take you with them. That kind doctor has told Grandpapa that you can both stay. It's a kind of payment for the cart they used and the food they took, and because we looked after you throughout all the winter. He says you can stay and work on the farm until the army needs you again. And they never will, and if they ever did, I'd hide you. We'll never let them take you away, will we, Grandpapa? Never, never." And so, after the long, sad farewells, the convoy moved away up the road in a cloud of dust, and we were left alone and in peace with Emily and her grandfather. The peace was to prove sweet but short-lived. To my great delight, I found myself once more a farm horse. With Topthorne harnessed up beside me, we set to work the very next day cutting and turning the hay. When Emily protested, after that first long day in the fields, that her grandfather was working us too hard, he put his hands on her shoulders and said, "Nonsense, Emily. They like to work. They need to work. And besides, the only way for us to go on living, Emily, is to go on like we did before. The soldiers have gone now, so if we pretend hard enough, then maybe the war will go away altogether. We must live as we have always lived, cutting our hay, picking our apples and tilling our soil. We cannot live as if there will be no tomorrow. We can live only if we eat, and our food comes from the land. We must work the land if we want to live, and these two must work it with us. They don't mind. They like the work. Look at them, Emily. Do they look unhappy?" For Topthorne, the transition from pulling an ambulance cart to pulling a hay turner was not a difficult one, and he adapted easily. And for me, it was a dream I had dreamed many times since I had left the farm in Devon. I was working once more with happy, laughing people around me who cared for me. We pulled with a will that harvest, Topthorne and I, hauling in the heavy hay wagons to the barns where Emily and her grandfather would unload. And Emily continued to watch over us lovingly. Every scratch and bruise was tended to at once, and her grandfather was never allowed to work us for too long, however much he argued. But the return to the peaceful life of a farm horse could not last long, not in the middle of that war. The hay was almost all gathered in when the soldiers came back again one evening. We were in our stables when we heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats and the rumbling of wheels on the cobblestones as the column came trotting into the yard. The horses, 6 at a time, were yoked to great heavy guns, and they stood in their traces puffing and blowing with exertion. Each pair was ridden by men whose faces were severe and hard under their grey caps. I noticed at once that these were not the gentle orderlies that had left us only a few short weeks before. Their faces were strange and harsh, and there was a new alarm and urgency in their eyes. Few of them seemed to laugh or even smile. These were a different breed of men from those we had seen before. Only one old soldier, who drove the ammunition cart, came over to stroke us and spoke kindly to little Emily. After a brief consultation with Emily's grandfather, the artillery troop bivouacked in our meadow that night, watering the horses in our pond. Topthorne and I were excited by the arrival of new horses and spent all evening with our heads over the stable door neighing to him, but most of them seemed too tired to reply. Emily came to tell us about the soldiers that evening, and we could see she was worried, for she would talk only a whisper. "Grandpapa doesn't like them here," she said. "He doesn't trust the officer. Says he's got eyes like a wasp, and you can't trust a wasp. But they'll be gone in the morning. Then we'll be on our own again." Early the next morning, as the dark of night left the sky, a visitor came to our stables. It was a pale, thin man in dusty uniform who peered over the door to inspect us. He had eyes that stood out of his face in a permanent stare, and he wore a pair of wire-framed spectacles, through which he watched us intently, nodding as he did so. He stood a few minutes and then left. By full light, the artillery troop was drawn up in the yard and ready to move. There was a loud and incessant knocking on the farmhouse door, and we saw Emily and her grandfather come out into the yard, still dressed in their night-clothes. "Your horses, monsieur," this bespectacled officer announced boldly. "I shall be taking your horses with us. I have one team with only 4 horses, and I need 2 more. They look fine, strong animals, and they will learn quickly. We will be taking them with us." "But how can I work my farm without horses?" Emily's grandfather said. "They are just farm horses. They won't be able to pull guns." "Sir," said the officer, "there is a war on, and I have to have your horses for my guns. I have to take them. What you do on your farm is your own business, but I must have the horses. The army needs them." "But you can't," Emily cried. "They're my horses. You can't take them. Oh, don't let them, Grandpapa. Don't let them. Please don't let them." The old man shrugged his shoulders sadly. "My child," he said quietly, "what can I do? How could I stop them? Do you suggest I cut them to pieces with my scythe, or lay about them with my axe? No, my child, we knew it might happen one day, didn't we? We talked about it often enough, didn't we? We knew they would go one day. Now I want no tears in front of these people. You're to be proud and strong like your brother was, and I'll not have you weaken in front of them. Go and say your goodbyes to the horses, Emily, and be brave." Little Emily led us to the back of the stable and slipped our halters on, carefully arranging our manes so that they were not snagged by the rope. Then she reached up and put her arms about us, leaning her head into each of us in turn and crying softly. "Come back," she said. "Please come back to me. I shall die if you don't come back." She wiped her eyes and pushed back her hair before opening the stable door and leading us out into the yard. She walked us directly towards the officer and handed over the reins. "I want them back," she said, her voice strong now, almost fierce. "I'm just lending them to you. They are my horses. They belong here. Feed them well and look after them, and make sure you bring them back." And she walked past her grandfather and into the house without even turning round. As we left the farm, hauled unwillingly along behind the ammunition cart, I turned and saw Emily's grandfather still standing in the yard. He was smiling and waving at us through his tears. Then the rope jerked my neck violently around and jolted me into a trot, and I recalled the time once before when I had been roped up to a cart and dragged away against my will. But at least this time I had my top thorn with me.